Yeah, I'm so sorry, Matam. Before we continue, I was told that, so we don't have a seminar next week. So the next one is on the 10th of August, and it's a panel discussion on decolonization. But I'm sure the poster will be circulated soon. But yeah, I think we were supposed to announce it because you're free next week. Although no, we have the conference, right? Okay, so yeah, we welcome Noha Fikry today. Noha is a graduate student at the University of Toronto in the Department of Anthropology. Noha, I came across Noha's work first. She was writing short pieces on current anthropology, something on rooftop animals. It is built out of her master's work on kind of caring and rearing of animals in the urban city by women, and we will learn more about that today. Noha has also published in food journals like Gastronomica. She has a chapter, I think, similar chapter we learn about today in a book, in an edited book on concepts from the global south, edited by Dilip Menon, which is actually a very widely read book, an early kind of contribution to the question of decolonization. And the attempt there was basically to say, how do we think about terms, from everyday life in various parts of the world that might tell us something about ethical and social life or political life beyond the usual terms that are inherited from the Western Academy. Noha was also part of the workshop which we convened last year in Utrecht, and she presented some fascinating work there. And we were very fortunate to have her because the university agreed to fund her trip here. I was advised by people that, to get a PhD student might be risky, but I managed to convince them that this is about student-centered learning and all other wonderful things. So just before I answer the thing about Noha's work, some of you are joining us tomorrow. We're reading some of her work and some people that inspire her. And if you're welcome to join, if you haven't got the email, just let me know. And the thing about it is this very detailed attention to ethnography. Almost a literary sensibility, where you are taken into people's world, very deep ethnographies, very good sense of what's happening, the complexity of what's happening, but at the same time woven in very lightly but meaningfully with important theories. Theories of care, theories of this place of religion and animals in urban life, ideas about every day, and we will learn more about it. And so I think we're very lucky to have Noha, and I must say, I told her yesterday already, she hasn't even started her PhD fieldwork, so I don't know what happens if you're so accomplished so early on, but hopefully not too big expectations. So anyway, thank you for coming, and we'll have a nice day.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Shahid, for making this happen, and thanks everyone for joining at the beginning of the semester, during lunchtime. I hope you are helping yourself with the sweets from Egypt. I hope you like them as well. So today I'm presenting somehow an edited version of the chapter that Shahid mentioned, in which I propose the concept or the main concept that I use in my fieldwork or to understand my fieldwork, which is Tarbiyya. So this was my proposition in that chapter, which discusses concepts that we try to bring out from our fields from the global south. So my talk is titled Tarbiyya, Thinking with Non-Humans from the Global South. It's all going to be pictures, and these are all pictures from my preliminary exploratory fieldwork, which takes place in a rural village on the Nile Delta in Egypt, where I have extended family members, so I have secured access. Okay, so prevalent in weekly markets in Egypt are home-reared animals. And these are more expensive and preferred than industrially grown and imported meats. The value of these home-reared animals is described through the Arabic word tarbiyya, which is a word that refers to the practice of rearing animals for food, but also raising and disciplining human children. These animals include chickens, goats, sheep, ducks, rabbits, pigeons, and are kept on rooftops, in courtyards, or in shared open enclosures. As an exploration of animals becoming meat, my project focuses on the livelihoods and human-animal relations of food among women in Egypt, and it's a very gendered practice, so it's just women who actually care for but also slaughter or kill the animals. So home-reared animals exist alongside a very fierce competitor, namely industrially farmed poultry and imported and frozen meat. Questions of feed, efficiency, and the genealogy or the quality of breeds primarily demarcate a home-reared animal from an industrially grown one. While animal production and husbandry yields itself to a discussion on food security and feeding populations, in the Egyptian and broader Middle Eastern context, scholarly discussions surrounding food are mainly limited to discussions of food security, food sovereignty, caloric intakes, nutritional deficiencies, increasing food and meat imports, and changing agrarian realities. By contrast, little has been written on the role of animals and the value of human-animal relations in food production or consumption in the region. While animals have been generally absent in scholarly discussion on the region more broadly, it is the intersection of food and human-animal relations and gendered labor that this research invokes as insightful to a more nuanced understanding of relationality, human-animal intimacy, gendered knowledge, and food in Egypt and the broader context of the Middle East and the Global South. More broadly, my project attempts a more than human and a gastronomically attuned ethnographic methodology, which relies on participant observation and interviews alongside eating and feeding animals. The main tension animating this research is threefold. So this is basically the main tensions, and then these are the bodies of literature that I use, or the bodies of theory that I use to build my proposal, which has been done already. So the main tension animating this research is threefold. The oscillation of non-human animals between nurtured, cute newborns and delicious meat, the oscillation of women between maternal caring mothers and killers, and the oscillation of rooftops and courtyards between spaces of nurturance and feeding to spaces of killing and spilled blood. The tension animates this research through its characteristic oscillation. So we're constantly moving between caring and killing, between blood and nurturance. But it's also, I use this oscillation or the movement to actually offer a broader de-romanticizing commentary on the defining tropes or gatekeeping concepts in the anthropology of the Middle East. Through oscillation, I illustrate that women care but also kill, that family and kin is support but also indifference or violence at times, that rural is bounty but also death and corpses, that animals are children but also meat. Alongside the animating tension, the oscillation, and the constitutive entry points that you can see here, the research hopes to answer a few questions. So from each oscillation, I have a series of questions that I attempt to answer in my project. So what are the social, human, animal, and material relations through which women farmers render an animal a corpse, a meat, and a meal? Alongside Tarbiyya, what are the other conceptual grammars that are used to describe human-animal relations? What does Tarbiyya do to a non-human animal? And is any animal or all species potentially subjects of Tarbiyya? What is the relationship between caring for and killing animals in that particular domain? And how do religious slaughtering rules facilitate these nodes of relations? And then the second one of caring and killing, is Tarbiyya a strictly gendered, feminized undertaking? How do different family members, such as children, but also men, relate to animals within or beyond Tarbiyya? How is a good enough mother constituted through Tarbiyya? What is the role of hospitality and feeding expected and unexpected guests in sustaining Tarbiyya in rural Egypt? And then what are the culinary values? And this is where I get a bit to the food studies angle. What are the culinary values associated with home-reared meat and its accompanying dairy products, such as milk, cheese, etc.? And then finally, the spaces. Do nurturing and killing take place in the same space in courtyards or rooftops? What are the channels through which chicks are sourced, feed circulates, and animals sold in rural Egypt? And then in the broader context of rural Egypt, how do different animals matter? As meat, as companions, as passerbys, as unseen agents of support, as playmates? And what are the shared bodily fluids, such as milk, blood, and saliva, that flow between humans and animals, and what possibilities of relations emerge from these? So during the first few days of fieldwork, whether it is for the PhD or for the master's earlier, I found it very hard to explain my project to my interlocutors. So in Arabic, the word species, let alone multi-species, fasilo, is very, very rare to be used in common parlance. I thus found it easier to introduce myself as a researcher interested in human-animal relations broadly, since the Arabic word for animals, hayawanat, is way more familiar and very less intimidating. It took only a few minutes for my interlocutors to mistake me for a veterinarian and to bombard me with questions on falling feathers and seasonal flu colds. I then shifted and began explaining my research in other terms. So, for example, I'm interested in anecdotes, in stories that involve animals of any kind. And after a few visits, I became known as Noha who's interested in Tarbiyya, without me ever prompting Tarbiyya. So this is when I began noticing that our concepts really emerged from our fieldwork, and then I began to focus on Tarbiyya, what is Tarbiyya, where does it come from, etc., which is what this essay is also trying to do. So Noha is interested in Tarbiyya. Before I began fieldwork, I never expected Tarbiyya to be my main conceptual tool and a hopeful intervention in multi-species ethnography from the Global South. So in this essay, I attend to the different contexts in which Tarbiyya is mentioned or uttered by my interlocutors. I experiment with three phases of Tarbiyya as a conceptual and a methodological tool that attends to both the more than human and the gastronomic aspects of my research. And in these three phases, I attempt to strike a balance between attending to the very intimate and close experiences of training, cultivating, and preparing food at home, on the one hand, and taking stock of the broader socioeconomic and political struggles of feeding families, lack of trusted meat, and maintaining social relations of kinship, on the other hand. Okay. So first is Tarbiyya as bodily training. So let me begin by a quick etymological exercise. In Lisan al-Arab, which is a classic Arabic dictionary, Rabb, which is the word for God, and Tarbiyya share a conceptual landscape. Since the masdar and the masdar is something like a root, so the masdar of Tarbiyya is rih, so RB, with tashdid or emphasis, and alif layina, which is like an A, but written as a Y. Whereas the masdar of Rabb is RB, rih, with tashdid, so RB and an emphasis. In most books of tafsir, or Islamic explanation, Tarbiyya is almost always one act or practice, including in explaining Rabb or God. In human-only contexts, Tarbiyya describes child rearing. In her research on pedagogical thought in 19th century Lebanon, Susanna Ferguson explains that Tarbiyya refers to the moral cultivation and the training of individuals to become obedient. Egyptian thinker Rifaa al-Tahtawi used Tarbiyya in 1872 to refer to the process of leading children out of ignorance. And it is at the turn of the century, more specifically, that we then find Tarbiyya becoming the primary responsibility of women only. So more specifically, we have here an idealized middle-class good mother who cares for her children. And she relied on a rational, modern, and hygienic principles to develop productive citizens. So pushed to my field site, the question then becomes, what does Tarbiyya entail when the body being trained or cultivated is that of a non-human animal? What does Tarbiyya do to a body to render it meat? And what everyday bodily work involves making meat, and what does Tarbiyya grown meat mean or entail? So in the context of rearing animals to become meat, Tarbiyya arguably entails a somewhat similar process of cultivation, of training, and of nourishment. Tarbiyya on rooftops and in courtyards encompasses maternal care, feeding, nurturing, and cleaning chores that women undertake every day to a variety of species. The end goal of this Tarbiyya, however, is not cultivated individuals, but cultivated meat. So given my limitations as a human, participant observation only grants me some of the perspective of the nurturing women, while living non-human animals is at best subjects of observation or subjects of food. In his research on Box's initiation, Louis Wacon proposes observation participation rather than participant observation as sometimes a more useful tool, especially in the initial phases of any research project. With non-human animals, I found observation to be a bit more helpful, especially again in the beginning, as a tool in ethnographic research. And in his account, Wacon argues that inculcation of boxing is a work of bodily training whose logic is largely similar to any other practice. So he breaks down this inculcation of box's dispositions into building the body, resocializing the physiology into a temporally structured body that is kinetically remodeled to the specific demands of the field. And then if we take this to operate on the level of the flesh, it means that the bodily training includes, for example, daily workout regimens, dietary habits, and sexual abstinence for particular periods that lead up to major tournaments. If we bring this back again to rooftops and courtyards, Tarbiyya in this rendition offers tools such as observing the physiological, the habitual, and the temperamental changes of animals along the course of their presence on rooftops and courtyards, while participating in these changes myself through feeding, nurturing, and implementing everyday animal routines. So unlike other vocabularies used to describe human-animal relations that give primacy to love and nurturance, Tarbiyya exposes but also largely justifies non-human bodily training and killing. In comparing Tarbiyya and Ta'aleem as the two main words in Arabic that are used to refer to education, Susanna Ferguson illustrates that Tarbiyya begins with what is there. So it is a process or an effort of fixing, of disciplining, of training, whereas Ta'aleem refers to the transfer of the new skills. So Tarbiyya here, this effort of fixing or disciplining what is there, is arguably almost always violent. So in this phase, Tarbiyya would entail observing, but also inquiring about acts of controlled or uncontrolled violence that take place through which women discipline the bodies to eat at certain times, for example, and certain foods, obviously, to also sleep in specific places and to mate at specific frequencies and to fatten to specific weights, but also die specific deaths. Okay, the second phase is Tarbiyya as thickening skin. So here I rely on another source to think with Tarbiyya, and this is ironically a cooking manual. And this cooking manual is called Fundamentals of Cooking Theory and Practice. It's in Arabic, Usul al-Tabkh, and it is by a very famous person. Her name is Nazira Nicolas, known as Abla Nazira in Arabic or in Egypt. And she provides a detailed description for chicken with Tarbiyya. And again, Tarbiyya is never used in the context of recipes. So this was a surprise for me, but I came across it like a friend in food studies just told me, what is Tarbiyya in recipes? And I'm like, there's no Tarbiyya in recipes. And she sends me a screenshot and I'm shocked. But then I kind of tried to work with it. So now I'll tell you the recipe. A boiled chicken or desired chunks thereof is laid down in cutlets in your serving dish while you prepare your Tarbiyya. In a pot over medium heat, you add ghee, chicken broth, milk, and most importantly, flour. You simmer the contents while stirring well for a few minutes until the desired thick consistency is reached. Now you pour the thick sauce over the chicken cutlets. You top it with fresh parsley, lemon juice, salt, and pepper as desired. In this particular usage of the word, Tarbiyya describes the thick sauce topping the chicken. More specifically, it refers to the thickness or the consistency of the sauce, rather than, for example, a cooking technique or a specific ingredients thereof. Because in other cooking manuals, but also TV cooking shows, we have Tarbiyya referring to a cooking sauce as well, but it is thickened with egg yolks and sometimes also a thick porridge-like soup. So Tarbiyya describes, again, a thickness or the process of thickening a sauce, but perhaps more. So pushing this emphasis on thickness further, I then ask, what is thickened during Tarbiyya as rearing animals on rooftops? Surely animals are thickened or fattened in the process, but could it also be the case that women's skin is likewise thickened in the process? In this rendition, Tarbiyya allows me to shift methodologically to the emotion work and the emotion control through which women nurture animals and then slaughter them. In this sense, Tarbiyya describes women's thick skin as an acquired capacity, offering methodological attention to the various emotional valences of nursing, feeding, caring, slaughtering, deskinning, defeathering, boiling, and eating animals. So this phase of Tarbiyya as thickening skin also offers a methodological turn to animals as meat and to the gastronomic qualities of these home-reared meats, thus a turn to women's embodied knowledge in kitchens. So here I also compare or try to seek inspiration from nafas, and nafas is the word that is in Arabic referring to women's energies as they cook, and how the energy gives a particular flavor to the food. So nafas also arguably operates as an energy that goes beyond tangible ingredients or cooking techniques. So as Reem Kassis explains in the case of nafas, nafas concerns the person preparing the dish and what they impart to the food, including time, energy, presentation, and the desire to feed loved others. So in this sense, both Tarbiyya and nafas denote women's care and labors in the kitchen. The meat from or of Tarbiyya carries the different energies of a woman as she cleaned, cared for, fed, repressed certain emotions or showed certain emotions such as fear or hatred, and slaughtered an animal. How these energies play out in meat is a methodological challenge for me. one which I attempt to address through unpacking the flavor and taste of meat, through paying particular attention to how women and other family members describe home-reared meat and its flavor. And this is something that I also do in the next place. Okay. Tarbiyya, a saving face, hospitality, and commensality. So during all my fieldwork trips, I am accompanied by my mother, and we both stay over at my mother's cousin, whose name is Hane. So being my mother's paternal cousin, Hane always feels the obligation to feed us well. One day during our stay, Hane's brother Hussein, who lives a few minutes away, came over and told us that we will have dinner at his place tonight. He ran quickly to the courtyard as Hane rapidly followed. My mother and I stayed on the terrace on the other side, with an insatiable curiosity about what was happening on the other side of the house. After around 10 minutes, I walked inside the house to find Hussein wiping his wet hands in his clothes, picking up a medium-sized opaque plastic bag, and walking back outside. While he tried to hide the bag as he walked, it was very clear that the bag was full and slightly heavy. Dinner will be ready in less than an hour, he assured us as he left back home. Expectedly, the brief visit from Hussein was a visit to kill a few ducks to serve us dinner. The killing was prompt, uneventful, and discreet. More importantly, it is a killing of a cared-for animal to feed a cared-for family, namely ourselves. When Hannah walked back to the terrace, she promised us an incredibly delicious meal, because these are her home-reared ducks that we will have for dinner. She witnessed the killing and was right next to Hussein in the courtyard, partook in eating the ducks, helped him doing the slaughtering, and praised herself for the good rearing and proudly asked us what we thought of the meal. While I do not eat ducks and enjoyed rice and vegetable stew on that day, my mother ate every bit of the ducks with utmost pleasure and indulgence. Alongside the boiled ducks, Hussein also served us little cups of clear duck broth. When I asked my mother how the ducks tasted, she told me that the ducks and the broth both tasted uniquely different from the ones we purchased at home in Cairo, store-bought. So I asked her again, how would you describe it? She told me the ducks and the broth were very minimally seasoned, but she insisted that it just tastes different, and she uses the word sweet, or musakkar in Arabic, and very wholesome, as in healthy, but in a very psychological sense of the word. Perhaps this is what Hane's promise entailed. In this instance, Tarbiyya operates through providing a good enough death for animals and a good enough life, through feeding, killing, and slaughtering in very particular ways, which only achieves its purpose with full-bellied, satiated, and nourished family members. So in many cultures in the Middle East, and perhaps more broadly, hospitality plays out as an orchestration of generosity, one that usually, if not always, involves food. In the context of social obligations to visit and host, hospitality relies on a consistent stock of food. Given the socioeconomic status of most of my interlocutors as working or lower middle-class families, a consistent access to meat is very impossible. More importantly, access to trusted meat rather than imported, frozen, or suspiciously cheap option is an everyday challenge. Where meat comes from, what it ate, and how it was reared all dictate the taste of meat, thus reflecting the competence of a family, and more particularly the woman, in her household and in front of guests. Because guests can arrive uninvited and without any prior notice, Tarbiyya in my field sites operates as a safety stock that prevents hosts from running to a store to buy any meat to serve to the unexpected guests. In this final phase, then, Tarbiyya translates as an attunement to the lives, the values, and the relations that Tarbiyya sustains, and the social valences of sustaining these relations. So this attunement entails following meat as it is cooked, served, and gifted in some senses, in instances of commensality, hospitality, and orchestration of saving face. Tarbiyya here also operates or entails observing the vocabularies used to describe Tarbiyya as a safety stock, through words in Arabic that include satr, which is like covering, but in a very proud sense of the word, and inquiring about the lack of Tarbiyya, or what happens if a household runs of home-reared animals. Conclusion. So, to contribute to a conceptual toolkit on knowledge production or just knowledge from the global south, I suggest that we begin with the geopolitical and the cosmological and the socioeconomic realities of our fields. Tarbiyya, for example, describes not only multi-species intimacy, nurturance, and care, but also the gastronomic biographies of well-fed families in the context of dire nutritional and financial need. Rooted in our socio-political, historical, and cosmological realities, a conceptual toolkit and an ethnographic conceptual stock on human-animal relations from the global south carves out space for pockets of relations that are otherwise usually deemed unworthy of attention or unfitting by gatekeeping cliches. And how I want to end is also that why I say that it opens up space for new pockets of research is that ever since I proposed this research as a master's student at the American University in Cairo, where I also did my BA, I was faced with a lot of resistance. Because again, there are gatekeeping concepts that define the Middle East and Egypt more particularly. And at that time, we were a bit after the 2011 revolution. So everyone was telling me, like professors, but also friends, but also activists who are interested in social sciences would tell me, this is not important. What is important is to discuss politics. What is important is to discuss Islam. What is important is to discuss. Once you're done with this, you can then shift to other not so important topics like as animals. And so it's a continuous fight of also making space and beginning with and from our fields to see what happens. Because if I go, for example, to my field site and I find my interlocutors always talking about the tarbiyya and always talking about feeding themselves in this context, then this is what I find most relevant to work on. So that's why I also find tarbiyya very, very dear to my heart in the sense that it's something that emerged from the field rather than beginning from my own intellectual curiosities alone. Such. Thank you, and looking forward to it.
Very short, so we have lots of time to unpack. Lots of observers too. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. HOD.
Thanks, Noah, for your very interesting presentation. So just a few quick questions that just occurred to me. One, are the animals ever named? And what are the stakes of naming? You know, you talk about loving rearing of the calves or young creatures, and then the killing. But is there anything about naming that happens in the process? Whether kind of a more, you know, a set name or maybe just a cute name that you give to, you know, maybe generically to all, you know, young animals, and what is at stake in the naming? Then I was curious about the kind of whether across different kind of class, whether you know, different fractions of class perhaps, whether this iterates differently. So might this look different if you have only access to a small courtyard or a small rooftop, and the number of animals you keep, around the negotiations maybe with landlords if you're renting versus owning? Might there be a, you know, even among people who are, you know, who are less well-resourced, maybe a tiny space in which my animals are kept, and maybe wealthier people can keep more. So what does it look like? And then finally, something about religion. Does this travel across? I mean, is it? I mean, I don't know that much about Egypt, but I mean, does it travel across more people who are more pious or less pious, or more secular perhaps? Does it travel beyond Islam, or is it restricted to Islam? So just some things to throw in there.
Thank you.
So I'm kind of commenting from a public health perspective, because that's one of my interests. I find it very, very interesting because you look at the demand for meat with growing middle class in China, etc., and the consequences in terms of environment and concerns of the production of consumption of cheaply produced meat and kind of products. You know, it's like a very unique story, so to speak, in this topic of something that's not probably well known. So I consider this research to be very, very important and a good example of looking back and being mindful about cultural practices that you need, which is very similar if you think about the food programs that we see on television and the emphasis on quality.
Yes.
And naturally grown is a relationship. Probably have your own food garden. And to animals as well. There's kind of a mindfulness about that I find beautiful. So I'm just commenting, but it would be really interesting to see if there's a shift in nutritional outcomes across the countries where these practices are in place and where food quality is, so to speak, at play. As a result of global demand. Apart from things like deforestation and consequences.
I think
Should I answer?
let's take two at a time.
Okay.
We have time, so, yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the comment. So the animals are never named, but and when I asked why, it was like the main answer that was given to me is that because we usually have a lot of animals, so it's very difficult to name all of them. But what I find interesting is that they name all non-food animals. So dogs are named sometimes, and there's usually dogs around. Cats are also named if they are kept as pets, but food animals are never named. But all of them are referred to as children. And in Arabic, they usually say we're going up to the rooftop to feed our children, wiladna. And this was what also prompted just this thinking of, okay, if they are very dear as children, how do you then eat them? And again, you can only make sense of this when you look at the broader cycles of care through which caring for the animals, killing the animals, caring for the family operate cyclically or together. So yeah, the reference to them as children and then food, the names are all very interesting, but it's something that I also want to look at more by, again, exploring if there are ever instances of naming a very particular animal. For example, if an animal is particularly sick or something. How does it translate differently across class? So it translates, as you said, particularly when it comes to the scale of the practice. So some people might be keeping just a few chickens, a few ducks, etc., like we saw on the first slide. And then others would keep way more, and then they would use them for selling. So they would sell them through informal channels at the village. So they have a weekly market, for example, and you would go there to buy chicks or chickens, ducklings or ducks. And so women would then go and sell their animals, or they would rely on a middleman, which also, we have his picture here, who, so this man, who gathers the chicks and the chickens from women who rear at home and then passes around on a tricycle to see who needs more chickens. So this is the second channel, and again, this is why one of the questions has been the channels through which these animals move. So once you are rearing more than you need, you begin selling or you begin gifting to extended family, including people who live in urban centers. So for example, they would send us animals often before I began my field. What else did I want to say about this class aspect? It's interesting because one of the things through which I'm also trying to make a stronger argument in that piece or intervention is that in Egypt, and I can see this also everywhere else, we have an intensifying valorization of everything organic, everything free range, everything. And what I try to argue also in the master's thesis is that, okay, but then whenever you're valorizing these practices, why are you only focusing on upper middle class elites who can have urban rooftop gardens, but are not rearing animals necessarily? So rearing animals in the particular domain of the city is regarded as a very unurban practice, as a very backward practice, as a very health-threatening practice. So we're never looking at these practices as something that we should hold on to, let alone valorize. And in fact, the sad story is that when I began applying for PhD, I reached out again to the families with whom I worked for them on my master's, and they're all in urban centers. And they all said, we're no longer rearing animals. Because some of these families were living in informal slums or historical sites. So the government has been kicking them out. So they were all forcibly relocated to new settlements at the outskirts of the city. And the spatial configuration doesn't allow them. So because you also mentioned class, so all of the families with whom I did my fieldwork for the master's and now, they own the houses where they rear the rooftops. So they actually have like a 2 or 3 story family, extended family home. And so they have full access to the rooftop. And same in my current rural field site. They also own the land and they own the house. So by extension, they have full access to the rooftop. Whereas in the new outskirts settlements, etc., they're very gigantic buildings. So you can't fight with 1,900 neighbors to figure out a space for rearing animals. So just the practice is dwindling in the city, which is horrible. And you have, on the other hand, the rise of the organic, the farms, etc. And it's interesting because also what I've been trying to do as part of the fieldwork is go on these visits to almost touristic farms that are in the city or the outskirts of the city, Cairo, and which package themselves as giving you a taste of the rural. And it always involves animals being reared as food, and children are invited to suck the cow, the kid, and it's just very sanitized, as you can imagine. It's a very aesthetized practice that doesn't touch upon. So, for example, the animals are never sold. They just get there. You get the story of them being reared as food, but you never get the food part, let alone the killing part. Religion, yes, it does travel across piety spectrum, because again, this is something that has to do with food, but you have to follow the religious rules of slaughtering. And it's not very complicated, but it's a ritual in and of itself. It involves invoking the name of God in a very particular way, and Shahid can speak more about that. And then also facing the Qibla. So it's a ritual because you are taking a life. And as a human taking a life of an animal, you must do it in very particular ways, otherwise it becomes unlawful. And it does also travel beyond Islam. So in my master's, I had 2 or 3 Christian families, I think 1 or 2, and they also had very similar patterns of how they speak about animals, how they slaughter, and the rules around slaughtering. And interestingly, in both cases, we both mentioned what is called an izn, or a permission in Arabic, so not everyone can slaughter. And so once you hit puberty as a male or female, you must be given the permission, and the permission to slaughter, and the permission to slaughter is given by your guardian. So the guardian is usually a mother, a father, or a husband. And it's interesting because when I presented parts of this research in my home, like at the American University in Cairo, I was pushed to think about this more. So one of my dear mentors, she told me, okay, but what is it about the permission? Why is it the guardian? And I was like, well, what is being told is that it is because that mother or that husband knows you very well. So he or she must be sure that you have the capacity or the strength of the heart to actually slaughter. And then she was like, but I think it's more, what is it? And she says something very illuminating. She told me that it is actually a mix of strength and softness of the heart that allows you to kill in a very particular way that doesn't hurt the animal as other contexts. So it's not just about caring, but killing with care or a very particular understanding of care. The comment is great. Yes, I think public health is so important, and it's also a very at heart ecological practice. And they don't say we are being ecological. They don't say we're being environmental. They don't say we are recycling, but they're doing it, right? So most of the feed for the home-reared animals actually comes from discarded food items, leftovers. So they actually go to the weekly markets towards the end of the day, and they ask everyone selling vegetables to give them the leftovers or whatever has not been sold for a reduced price or just for free. And especially if you think about, again, urban centers and informal settlements, you have a very, very, very huge problem of waste. So recycling this waste by feeding it to animals is amazing. But again, not recognized at all, on the contrary, shunned upon, kicked out, etc. So one of the things that I'm also trying to argue in this piece is that it's also an ecological practice that we should all kind of learn from, by at least not discarding the leftovers, for example, because we also have a problem of rising feed prices. And what is interesting is also, and what I'm pushing in my fieldwork, is that we have a lot of TikTokers and YouTubers who share, who just, like, the entire channel is just for rearing animals at home. So you have these wonderful women, middle-aged, who just every day wake up and video or like film the routines with the animals, what they feed them, where they are, what has been happening, this sick one has been sick. They just narrate it. And they give you all the tips and hacks of what to do when they're sick, what to do to increase their immunity, what to do when feed prices go very high and you want to feed them, how do you do that? How do you integrate some of the food items at home, etc. So yeah, a lot is happening.
Great. Yes.
Thanks, Noha.
Hi.
Lovely presentation. I really enjoyed the talk, and thanks for the lovely sweetmeats as well. That's really welcome. I'm interested in how you're thinking about and conceptualizing the more than human and human relationship. So, firstly, just a little bit around the terminology. Where you started to talk, well, the title is about more than human, but in your talk you refer to non-human animals and so on, and whether there's a sort of any thinking around making that distinction and how you see then the connection between human and more than human.
Yes.
And then more specifically around care and the care being practiced in these different forms, which are all very exciting and so on. But from your fieldwork, or even in terms of your conceptualization of tarbiya, I'm interested in the direction of care, right? Is it conceived of as moving between human and non-human, or between the women and the animals? And is that the only direction in which it goes? I mean, what sort of kind of effective reciprocity is there in terms of the care being given to animals in a particular way, and children also, for that matter?
I'm not gonna ask my question because I was also thinking around this idea of human and non-human.
Yes.
Or maybe I could just maybe as footnote to Haya's question. Have you ever thought about this practice beyond the context? Maybe consider how in other parts of Africa, like in South Africa, this idea of human and non-human, how it plays out, especially in the context where tradition and religion is involved. Because you mentioned earlier the right to slaughter, you know, and you reminded me of, in our culture we have inside someone who within a family would be given the legitimate right to slaughter, not just everybody. You could be homeless, you could be what we call here in Stellenbosch, your family might have forgotten about you. But if there is an important ritual that needs to be performed, they would see to it that they find you, because you are the most important person who's supposed to perform the slaughtering, for specifically if that involves the ancestors. And for me, that creates some sort of a tension, because when you speak about human, the question is, what makes us human? And in that particular context, what makes us human? And animals are meant to die. We are meant to kill one another anyway. Some kind of an ecosystem. We're in some kind of an ecosystem. But then what makes us human and what makes us not human? Just the tension around the two. Yeah, thank you so much.
One more question. Okay, go ahead.
I think you kind of touched on it about the smoothing in specific ways that the officers do in Islam. But you know, so on Eid al-Adha was to Shira. So I want to know if there's this concept of, I can't say it, does it still play? Does it still come through like on specific days like Eid al-Adha? Is the different meaning or different reasoning behind slaughtering the sheep right on this specific day? But do we do you still see this whole concept, this whole idea play through on that day as well?
That's perfect. Should I answer it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Khayat. So my master's supervisor, her name was Munira Khayat, so the name is very dear to my heart. So the more than human and the non-human, yes, absolutely. So because this is more of a presentation about one particular aspect, so one of the questions I think on the slide where the questions were laid out is that I'm also interested in all the other animals or more than humans that are in my field. And some of these include unseen more than humans. So in that sense, we have angels, we have jinns, and they play out very different roles from the ones that are like from food animals. So one of the primary observations that I've been having is that with food animals, it's really a process of caring with an intention of killing in mind. So it's a caring that, because again, when it comes to the directionality, it's a caring that has its end as killing and as such attempts to domesticate the animal in very particular ways, control the animal, to discipline the animal in a particular way. Whereas other more than humans in my field site, who are not food animals, or sometimes unseen, are very much welcomed as guests. And that's why I use hospitality. So they come, they visit, these are even the words used. They can eat, they can drink if they want, but you wouldn't alter the nature at all. You would respect, you would accept their authority and keep it at that. Whereas with food animals, again, tarbiyya entails a very much a process of caring and killing together. So violence, changing the authority or domesticating the authority in a very particular way, which is very different from what happens with the other animals. So in this particular section, I only focus on food animals because this is again the primary emphasis. But by zooming out and engaging with all the other actors in the field, I also hope to again show the spectrum of non-humans that exist in the field. Because one of the critiques that I also have of multi-species ethnography is that very particular species make it to the canon as such. And these are usually charismatic species. So what I'm trying to also find out is how we have a spectrum of non-humans and more than humans, and you cannot just flatten it out. Because they play different roles, they are variously constituted as the actors, and something that ethnography can teach us is how we can attend to all of them differently, especially when it comes to invisible or unseen agents or unseen non-humans. How can you engage with them? How can you understand them? How can you write about them? How can you prove if they exist? So these are all questions that I hope to also think about. So yes, the directionality of care, I think it operates primarily from women to non-humans, or to food animals in this particular case. But it's interesting because when I also speak, especially with slightly older women, so like the grandparents, they would tell me we cannot live in a house without animals. I was like, okay, but what happens? Because I'm sure there were moments historically in which you had no animals. And she'd be like, no, it never happened. At least I need a few chicks. At least I need a few animals. Because otherwise I feel very dead. I feel very disconnected. They provide company, especially when children grow up and they get married and they just are not necessarily close to her or as close to her. She finds purpose and she seeks company with these animals. And the other interesting part, but this was a bit more in the master's research and it also responds a bit to your question, is that we have pigeons. And pigeons are the domain of men. They are not edible pigeons, and men are the primary caregivers and takers of the animals. And how they speak about pigeons is so different from tarbiyya. So the word that in Arabic that is used for the practice of rearing pigeons is the ghawi, and the ghawi in Arabic is about passion, and it's about longing for company, for love, etc. And it's about a hobby. Tarbiyya is not a hobby. And whenever I speak to women, I purposefully ask, would you consider tarbiyya a hobby? And they're like, no, it's not a hobby. Is it a job? No, it's not a job. It's something between, but it's not passion. It's not just passion. With men, it operates very differently. And yes, I'm interested also to see what kind, again, what possibilities of relations emerge from many pigeon relations and how they speak about it. And again, the reciprocity comes from the company that pigeons offer to men. So in some cases, one of my interlocutors would say that after a very busy day of work and he had like 2 jobs, after that he would be like totally tired, but he'd insist to go up to feed the pigeons and to spend at least 2 hours with them all alone. And I'd be like, okay, what do you do with them? And he'd be like, I'd write poetry. And would you share it with anyone? He'd say, no, I cannot share it with anyone, except, not even my wife. So they are just, no, it's just for them. And he got very embarrassed and I'm like, okay, no worries. So it's a very different, view, more nuanced view of masculinity that emerges from there, which I appreciate. And yes, beyond Egypt, I think I need to do a bit more work on that. But we have the work of one of my dear colleagues at University of Toronto. His name is Mohammed Kabash, and he works on Pakistan. And he has also been focusing on man-pigeon relations, and he uses the word shawq, which is an Arabic but also Urdu, I think, word. And shawq is also, again, about passion, about love, which is, again, not the discipline, the domestication that you get in Tarbiyya. And it's, again, in his case, a very dominated practice. So, yeah, we've been thinking together about Tarbiyya, shawq, and where do they both take us. And I have been reading a bit more on indigenous populations and how they think of animals and how they think of more than humans in the relations of eating, but also beyond. And I find this very, very helpful because usually, as you also can imagine, whenever I present this research, especially in the global north, I'd be told, oh, of course you're vegan, this might be very difficult for you, we're sorry. And I'd be like, I'm not vegan, I'm not even vegetarian, it's fine. So you have to also like speak in the different audiences. And I think also part of, especially in the caring killing literature review that I had for my proposal, one of the primary conclusions that I had, or preliminary conclusions that I had, was that part of what makes us human is how we kill. And how we kill animals in particular, but also in some cases how we kill humans. So, and how we conceptualize where the bodies go and how they become waste or not. The Eid question, totally spot on, yes. Tarbiyya does come up in Eid, although not as explicitly, because most of the animals that are reared on rooftops, or at least what is more common, are poultry, so chicken, ducks, etc. You have also goats, but on Eid in particular, they usually slaughter sheep, and they usually buy them from farms or surrounding areas. But what is interesting is that one of my interlocutors told me a few months back is that it's actually now preferable, and one sheikh came out on TV and he said that, and it's very new, that if you purchase a sheep and you don't know how it was fed, you have to keep the sheep on your rooftop or at home, wherever you're rearing animals, and feed the sheep carefully for a few weeks or months before slaughter. So that it's a bit like making sure that the belly of the sheep is trusted, and thus the meat is halal. So it's a very interesting practice. So I think this would be where Tarbiyya is invoked, is that even if we buy the sheep old enough and mature enough to be slaughtered, we still have to kind of intervene in how the sheep is been fed. Yeah, thank you.
Great, yeah, fantastic. Both the presentation and the discussion. It just gets more and more complicated. I'm not sure I have much to add, except I was struck by, I did my PhD in Zimbabwe many years ago, and I had to attend the slaughter of a cow. And the owner of his house has stated he wasn't expected to be. So the intimacy of the relationship meant that he had to have some distance from this. So his brother-in-law came and chopped him. I went like this as it happened. So, you know, this thing about care and killing, strength and weakness. So this man could display what some could see weakness, he couldn't do it, but it was accepted, and it could be read as care. And there are many reasons. So I think Hilton White, an anthropologist that Wits gave a talk here, spoke about African chickens and white chickens. The white ones are from the supermarket. They're not the real ones. That's about authenticity.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago, but I remember that. And I was thinking about it as we were talking. And then the final one is more a tangent. Like, you mentioned a good enough mother. Are you thinking of Winnicott?
Yes, of course.
Which it makes it really
Absolutely.
interesting, because then it's like, it's traveling.
Yes.
From the human to more than human.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's great. I really enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. I find this particularly interesting for a number of reasons. The person who I was going to refer to is gone now, but 2 days ago I was actually talking about my fear of killing chickens. And it's quite funny and ironic, because as a traditional practitioner, the killing of chickens is like something that happens so frequently that I should be used to with by now. But also because in a very traditional context, when chickens are killed, normally it's the women who do that for families, as a form of care, as a form of love, and so forth. So, I mean, I'm really interested in this care work that, sort of like we're talking about. And I have a question that I have is, in these species of animals, chickens, ducks, goats, is it gendered as well in terms of like who kills them? Because let me just say in the Zulu culture, a chicken is normally killed by a woman, a goat, a sheep. It's not that gendered really, but a cow, normally a man will kill the cow, right? And even the places where these animals are killed are also very specific, right? You won't just randomly kill a cow in the open. It has to happen in a particular place, in a particular manner. But also it would be very odd or rare for me to like just walk up and be like, okay guys, I'm here, I'll kill the cow. Yeah. It's a very gendered thing. The women sort of stand, So I'm very interested in that as well, how that would play out when we think about notions of care and gendered care. And the question of spirituality and religion, right? Of like, who's there, who's not there. When a cow is killed, for example, or a goat is killed in like traditional sort of initiation ceremonies or something, the spirits are evoked, because even the way that the animal dies, it has to be willing to die. Yeah. And that is also sort of observed in a particular manner. So I'm interested if something like that also happens, or if it's sort of like this very like hushed thing almost, where it's not, and even if it is a hushed thing, where's the spirit in that? And I'm not talking about the spirit killing, but like, like the spirits, where are they in that particular context? But I think what also was interesting when we talked about the feeding of the animal, I have it's not a funny story, it's a bit sad actually, but a couple of months ago, I had to buy 2 goats for a ceremony. And then I bought the 1 goat ahead of time to like save the cost of having to go back and get it again. And I was warned by like, elders that you don't do this because you're gonna have to feed it yourself. Obviously, being Mzamo, I failed to feed the animal properly, and then the animal started getting sick. And I was told it's because you're not feeding it and caring for it properly. So I was told you have to care for this animal. If you don't care for it, its death will be because you didn't care for it. Yeah. The animal eventually died, which means I didn't care for the animal well. But I mean, I think this is particularly interesting because, obviously, it's a sad story. Anyway, I keep my going. That's the story.
We'll take it. That's fine.
But it's about I cross the boat. It happens. Right? But I mean, the thing what I find interesting here is this. It's the notion of care, but also how you care. Yes. And I do care for animals. It's a similar thing. How you care, but also how you feed it. It also like comes into it, right? So I had to feed it in a particular way with my Model C tendencies. Obviously, I wasn't like, wasn't feeding it well enough. But yeah, anyway, what a sad story. I killed a goat. Yeah.
That's a great interview. I'm not being sarcastic, I think it's very important.
It's just bad that as a single man killed a goat.
Yeah, no, we'll let know. But I want to take the ice okay. Yeah, I'm not. Shall we take them now? Do you want to?
We can answer first.
Okay. You guys.
Okay, don't worry, it's fine. Actually, one of my favorite interlocutors from the masters, please eat sweet. One of my favorite interlocutors from the masters, she was narrating this story. She got married, right? And a few weeks after her marriage, she got very bored. And she's like, I have to do something with my time, I can't. So everyone told her, okay, just buy a few chickens or goats or whatever and just figure out your thing. She's like, okay, I always watched mom do it at home. I do it, nothing terrible. She wanted to be so good, so she overfed the goat, right? And then whenever the goat would be like, she'd be like, oh my God, I need more food, right? And then she called her mom and she's like, okay, now, I don't know, like whenever she does the sound, I give her more food. Why is she looking a bit tired? And she's like, you're not getting it right. She doesn't want more food. And she's like, water? And she's like, no, she just wants you to leave her alone. So eventually she just again like had to